Hello everyone, welcome to another video. I thought this time around we would do something maybe a little bit different, although I think maybe I opened the last video with the exact same statement. But what I was thinking about was when I first became a Christian, which was a few years ago now, people told me it's really, really important that you need to read the Bible. So I read the Bible. One person at church, I remember saying to me, what you really need to do is you need to read the entire New Testament from start to finish. So I did that as well. I remember sitting down and I remember it took a few days and I read the whole thing. And what I remember probably most significantly out of that time period was I remember getting absolutely nothing out of it. I remember, I think I was somewhere in the book of Romans, and I remember just thinking, I don't know what's happening. I don't understand. I'm not following it at all. Now, I definitely believed in God. I think it's fair to say that it was my faith in God that kept me reading, because in a physical sense, I didn't feel like this was going anywhere. But I figured as a matter of faith that maybe God would do something with this effort that I was making, or maybe do something through it, and ultimately that something good would come from this exercise. So that's what kept me reading. And I got all the way to the end of Revelation, but I just remember it being a giant ball of confusion to me. I had no idea what I was reading or what I was supposed to be getting from it. And it wasn't until quite a few years later that I started to get a decent sense of the overall narrative of the Bible, where the arc of the Bible story goes. And so I thought it might be a helpful thing to make a video where we do a high level flyover of all 66 books of the Bible. If we talk about perhaps the time periods that they were written in, who the books were written to, the approximate scope perhaps of the books. And the other thing I thought might be helpful along the way is if we call out some well known Bible narratives as we go forward. For example, I grew up with what I would describe as some cultural exposure to the Bible. I didn't read the Bible as a child, but just growing up where I grew up, there was a certain amount of exposure to what I would call certain cultural aspects of the Bible. I knew about Adam and Eve in the garden. I knew about Moses crossing the Red Sea. I knew about Noah and the flood, things like that. So I thought it might be helpful if we call out where some of these narratives are in the Bible, so that if you're perhaps someone that doesn't have a whole lot of exposure to the Bible, you might have heard of Noah, just like I had, but you might not know, if you wanted to actually sit down and read what the Bible actually says about Noah, you might not know where to find that. So I thought it might be helpful to include that as we go. So, enough preamble. I think we have 66 books to get through. But with that in mind, I think probably we'll turn this maybe into two videos. I think it might be an idea just to make a video like this. We'll cover off the Old Testament, and then maybe we'll make a follow-up video and do the same thing for the New Testament books. So if we take a look at the books of the Old Testament here, the very first book of the Bible is a book called Genesis. The word Genesis means generations, and chronologically, Genesis is the first book. It's really a book about birth. It's a book about new things. And it's also a narrative book. And what that means is it describes things that took place, things that happened. Now, moving through the book of Genesis, it's a long book. It covers a lot of history. Chapter 1, we read about God creating the heavens and the earth. In chapter 3, we read about Adam and Eve in the garden, eating the forbidden fruit and the resulting fall that comes from that. In chapter 6, we read about Noah and the flood that follows. And all the way down to chapter 37, we meet the man Noah and, no, we don't. We meet the man Joseph and his multicolored coat. Following after the book of Genesis, we get to the book of Exodus. Exodus is another historical narrative book, and it follows historically after the book of Genesis. In chapter 3, we meet the man Moses, and we see him at the burning bush. In Exodus chapter 7, we read about the beginning of the plagues that besiege the nation of Egypt. In chapter 14, we see Moses leading his people across the Red Sea. And then later on in chapter 20, we see Moses again at Mount Sinai receiving the Ten Commandments from God as the beginning of the Old Testament law that God gave for Israel to follow. With that in mind, following on after Exodus, we come to the book of Leviticus, and Leviticus is a book of specifics of the law that God gave to Israel. One of the things I'll say about you're reading through the law, another difficult Bible journey that I had as a new Christian is reading through these details of the law. I remember reading, actually, I think I was in the book of Leviticus, and I was reading about the grain offerings, I believe it was, that Israel were supposed to tithe, and all these details about when this happens, you're supposed to do this, and you divide your grain into this, and you bring your grain to here, and I remember reading this, and I remember thinking, I understand now what I'm reading. I at least follow what the text is telling me. What I don't understand here is, why is this in the Bible? Because I understood that the Bible was God's revelation to his children, to those that would follow him. But I didn't know why I needed to know about all of these laws that were written to Israel thousands of years ago. And we could probably make a whole series of videos on the answer to that point. But at a high level, I would say that a lot of the Old Testament law that we read about was designed to paint a picture of what Jesus Christ would be in terms of his nature and what he would do in terms of his work when he came. So I think the answer to my point there, at a very, very high level, is to say that we read the Old Testament law, we understand all of those points of the law, and then when we read the New Testament and we read about Jesus Christ coming, we can line it all up and we go, that's how we see that he fits, right? I think that's part of that answer. So the book of Leviticus, following after Leviticus, is another book, the book of Numbers. Numbers is more laws given to Israel by God. The beginning of the book contains details of a census of the tribes of Israel. That's where the book name comes from. And the book of Deuteronomy follows after that. Even more law given to Israel by God. The name Deuteronomy means literally second law, and that doesn't mean that there were multiple laws. This book takes place historically just before Israel enters into the Promised Land, and essentially what they do is they reread, they restate their law a second time before entering into the land. So that's where the name Deuteronomy comes from. Now, if you're into terminology, the first 5 books of the Bible are sometimes referred to as the Pentateuch. If you want to try to remember that word, a pentagon is a shape that has 5 sides. So the Pentateuch literally means 5 books. The first 5 books of the Bible here: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The books are sometimes always referred to as Torah in Jewish cultural terms, which is a reference specifically to the law of the Old Testament, more so than just the books themselves. So if you hear a reference to the Pentateuch, it's talking about these books. If you hear reference to the books of the law or to Torah, it's all talking about these same 5 books. Now, moving forward, we come to the book of Joshua, and Joshua is another book of historical narrative that follows the history of the nation of Israel, following on from the death of Moses. Then comes the book of Judges, which is another book of history. And this is a time, the book of Judges covers a time in Israel where they decide to elect, not surprisingly, a number of judges over them to provide leadership in the land. The narrative about Samson, for example, remember Samson, the strong guy, is found in the book of Judges. Chapter 13 is where we begin to read about Samson. Following the book of Judges, the book of Ruth tells us a story of a wife in the land of Israel that has some bad things happen to her. But the story serves as a prophetic picture. I won't dig too much into the details of how and why. Maybe wouldn't save that for another video. But essentially, the reason why this book is in the Bible is that it serves as an allegorical picture for something that God does through human history. After the book of Ruth, we come to 1st and 2nd Samuel, which are more historical narrative books named after Samuel, who was a prophet in Israel at the time. And what that means is that he heard from God, he was able to inquire certain things of God and then relay back what God was saying to the people. Historically, the books follow one after the other. In 1 Samuel, we read in chapter 7 about a young David killing Goliath. In chapter 8, we see the nation of Israel demanding a king, moving away from the judges model that they had before. Their first king was a man named Saul, and that didn't go particularly well. Then in chapter 31, at the end of 1 Samuel, Saul is killed. David has grown up by then, and so it kind of paves the way for David to be king. And then in 2 Samuel, immediately after, we see David affirmed as king, notwithstanding some power struggles and mistakes along the way. One such mistake is found in chapter 11. We read about the narrative of David and Bathsheba, which is not one of his finest moments by any stretch. After the book of 2 Samuel, we come to 1st and 2nd Kings, which is even more historical narrative, following on through history. Again, the second book follows the first. In the book of 1 Kings, in chapter 2, we read about the death of David. In chapter 6, David's son Solomon begins building a temple to God. Down in chapter 11, Solomon dies. And in chapter 12 of 1 Kings, we read about the nation of Israel splitting into two. They essentially, up until this point, Israel had tribes within the land, 12 tribes within the land. At a certain point, they decide to elect 2 different kings, and they disagree about who's going to be the king, so they decide that they both are. So the northern portion of Israel retains the name Israel, sometimes also referred to as the Northern Kingdom. In the south, they're referred to as Judah from that point forward in the Bible. So that begins in chapter 12. Then in 2 Kings, we read about in chapter 17, the northern kingdom of Israel is defeated and taken captive by the nation of Assyria. They are essentially removed from the map from that point forward. Historically, that took place around 732 BC. And then in chapter 24 of 2 Kings, we read about the Babylonian Empire defeating and exiling the folks in Judah in the south. So at this point, both kingdoms have been defeated, and that Babylonian invasion of Judah takes place around 605 BC. The significant difference between the northern kingdom and Judah in the south is that the Judah exile into Babylon does have an endpoint in history, and Judah does get to return back to the land, as we'll see in a couple minutes here. So, following on, First and Second Chronicles are similar books of narrative history, similar to First and Second Kings. They capture the history of Israel, a little bit different from the pattern we've been following, though, in that First and Second Chronicles cover much of the same time frame as First and Second Kings. They don't just simply follow on after. In First Chronicles, in fact, the first 8 chapters of First Chronicles actually go all the way back to Adam, and they list a series of genealogies down through the nation of Israel. In chapter 11 of First Chronicles, we see David again being made king. In chapter 23, we see Solomon again being made king. David is still alive at this point, and that holds true until the end of chapter 29, the very last chapter of the book. We read about David passing away. That takes us to Second Chronicles. We read about David's son Solomon dying in chapter 9. And right at the end of the book, Second Chronicles chapter 36, we read about the Babylonian defeat of Judah. Now, Judah were exiled into Babylon for 70 years. And after those 70 years have elapsed, we come to the book of Ezra. And the book of Ezra begins with the defeat of the Babylonian Empire by the Medo-Persians. And the Medo-Persians tell the Israelites that some of them can return to Jerusalem to reestablish their temple and to worship their God. Historically, this takes place in 539 BC. The book of Ezra is followed by the book of Nehemiah. The book of Nehemiah builds upon the events of Ezra. In Ezra, as we just talked about, the Israelites come to Jerusalem and start rebuilding their temple. In the book of Nehemiah, they are given permission to actually return to Jerusalem and to rebuild the city wall and to begin to re-establish the city of Jerusalem. Nehemiah chapter 2 tells us that these events begin in the 20th year of the Medo-Persian king Artaxerxes, and so historically that brings us out to 445 BC. Now, you may not guess this from looking at the list of books here, but Nehemiah is actually chronologically the last book of the Old Testament that takes place. And as we move forward and look at the other books, we'll see how that fits together. After the book of Nehemiah, we come to the book of Esther. Esther tells the story of a brave young Jewish girl who puts her own life, her own safety on the line, is what I meant to say, to offer protection to her fellow Israelites who are in the midst of persecution. Chronologically, though, the book of Esther takes place within the time frame of the book of Nehemiah. Now, these books that we've looked at are sometimes referred to as the books of history within the Old Testament, all the way from Joshua all the way down to Nehemiah and to Esther that we've just looked at. Next up, we have a series of books that are sometimes referred to as books of wisdom. Job is a book essentially about the sovereignty of God revealed through a man who loses everything, but ultimately, through his life process, he comes to a greater understanding of who God is. The book of Psalms is the longest book of the Bible, mostly written by King David. And the Psalms are essentially songs written in response to life events. So, as we read of the life of David, we read of various ups and downs, various things that happened to him. And then as we read the book of Psalms, we read Psalms of victory, Psalms of defeat, Psalms of faith, Psalms of doubt. You name it, they're in there. A great book for capturing life's experiences. Following the Psalms, books of Proverbs, the book of Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, these contain, I guess I would summarize as poetic or allegorical writings intended to reveal to us truths about who God is and what he's like. Moving on from these wisdom books, we come into the prophets. The prophets are divided into major prophets and minor prophets, but essentially the content and the theme of the books is largely the same, which is that God calls people throughout history to serve as his mouthpiece to the people during various times and various events. Now, rather than go chapter through each book of the prophets, it probably would be more helpful as an overview to just depict the times and the events in history at which each prophet was called and served, so we can kind of interweave the prophets through Israel's history. The other thing I will say about the prophets is that sometimes more than one was serving God at any given time. It wasn't it wasn't kind of like the president of the United States where you have one person in the seat and then they're in the seat until they're not in the seat and then somebody else sits in the seat. As an example of that, when Judah was exiled to Babylon, which happened, as we said before, around 600 BC, the prophet Daniel was sent with the Israelites into Babylon. The prophet Ezekiel was also exiled into Babylon in around the same time. The prophet Jeremiah was serving again around the same time, but he remained in Israel. So all of those prophets were operating in around a similar time frame. So if we go through the prophets, actually, if we go through in chronological order, it might give a more helpful picture of how they fit into human history. First is the prophet Jonah, the guy who was swallowed by a fish. He served somewhere around 800 BC, and he was prophesying to the northern kingdom of Israel prior to their defeat by Assyria. Other prophets of the northern kingdom were Joel, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, and then Micah. And then prophets that served the southern kingdom of Judah were Nahum, Zephaniah, and Habakkuk. And then prophets that were involved in around the Babylonian exile, as we talked about, Jeremiah, Daniel, Obadiah, and Ezekiel. And then finally, prophets that served after the exile and the subsequent return to Jerusalem of Judah were Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So those cover the Old Testament prophets, and that brings us to a close on all of the books of the Old Testament. One other thing I will say about the books of the Old Testament in regards to terminology, if you've ever happened upon the Hebrew term Tanakh, This is another term that is used to refer to the entirety of the Old Testament. The term Tanakh is actually a compound word, and it refers to the Torah, the books of the law, as we talked about, in addition to the Nevi'im, or the prophets, in addition to the Ketuvim, or the writings. So you take those three terms and you kind of cut them into pieces and you smoosh them all together and you come up with this word Tanakh. So the law plus the prophets plus the writings gives you the entirety of the Tanakh. The other thing that I will say in regard to terminology, you can find in the New Testament, in the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, Jesus makes a statement to the crowd as he's delivering this sermon, and he says to the crowd, "Do not presume that I came to abolish the law and the prophets." What Jesus is talking about here is the Old Testament. You know, he wouldn't have used the term Old Testament because at the time Jesus was speaking, they didn't have any such thing as a New Testament. So the Old Testament wouldn't have made a lot of sense as a term. So what Jesus is actually saying is that he's giving them all of these profound truths, basically shaking up their entire world and their faith. And then he pauses and says to them, "Hey, by the way, don't think that I've come to negate the Old Testament. I've actually come to fulfill the Old Testament." So that's all of the books talked about. That covers off our 100,000 foot flyover of the Old Testament. Please feel free to check back next time. We will do the same thing with the New Testament books. Thank you very much for watching. If this video was helpful to you at all, please feel free to like and to subscribe. Leave a comment if you wish, and we will see you for the next video. Thanks a lot. Have a good day.